Thank you so much, Mikko. Thank you to all the organizers as well as the other presenters. And indeed, this presentation refers to a work in progress that I've been involved with, together with Giovanni, here present, but also Letizia Chiappini, who is not here right now. And yeah, so just a little bit of background. Well, so there is, in general, in the recent literature about platforms, greater sensitivity about the need to move beyond what we can refer to as universalist attitude towards platformization, which, especially in the past, was often perceived as a, what is only or mainly a global process that somehow fall in the local context and create some patterns of mostly uniformity. Following a number of authors, we believe, and we tried with our research indeed to highlight empirically how the urban context plays a crucial role in shaping what Van Doorn and others calls actually existing platformization, and how that, like, the geographical dimension is important not only from the perspective of the strategic role that plays from the level of how platforms evade regulations and make use of differences in the labor market, but also how indeed geography plays a role from the perspective of the workers themselves, so the experience of the workers. So our research, more in particular, covers delivery riders, which became probably the most visible segment of the so-called platform capitalism, especially from a urban level. Like in most cities in the world, the urban landscape is populated by these people biking or riding other means of transportation around the city. And well, when we started it was an emerging topic of research. Now it's actually booming, because I would say that the quite obvious societal importance of such topic. And current research has been focusing on a number of themes, such as indeed working conditions, especially from a regulatory perspective, the emergence of solidarity in such a fragmented workforce, and the algorithmic forms of algorithmic resistance and tactics which are put into place by riders. And well, we went on the field, maybe I will explain this a bit later, with a bit of a different plan that also had to deal with the fact that conducting a global comparative study in the midst of a pandemic with travel restriction, etc., didn't prove super easy. But nonetheless, we managed to find, we believe, a number of potentially interesting insights that ended up focusing more on indeed the aspect associated to the urban dimension and the embeddedness of the experience of delivery riders in the urban context. So in terms of focus, indeed, we looked at how the urban context affects the platformization of labor by paying attention to the interaction between the process of platformization, the urban ecologies in which it takes place, as well as pre-existing cultural dispositions, and our point of observation in particular, at least the one that emerged from our interviews, was the lived experiences of riders and their working conditions. So initially, as said, we were planning to conduct a proper and structured comparative work between Amsterdam, Milan, and Buenos Aires, also with the idea of taking the same global platform, which was Uber Eats, as a sort of constant in order to indeed compare and see how the local context would affect our object. A number of reasons, contingent reasons, let's say, made Buenos Aires the main focus of our research, and also indeed the one from where we got more insights. And also we gave up the idea of keeping, the same company as a constant and seeing variations among contexts, especially because during the process of research, Uber Eats stopped operating in Argentina. So which tells a lot, I believe, about how the contingency of this type of research sometimes requires readaptation. Well, Buenos Aires is indeed a mega city beyond the West, whereas current research has mostly focused, at least until 1 or 2 years ago, on the US and on China, on the other hand. It has, we observed at least, a widespread presence of these delivery platforms, and also it has a pre-existing history and culture of delivery, pre-platformized delivery. And as well as persistent importance of informal economy, which indeed makes the context quite different from other, for example, European global cities. Nonetheless, we also conducted interviews as well in Amsterdam and Milan, less, and we also engaged with grassroots organizations of riders in the different contexts, although this side of the research was way more preliminary than the other. So we conducted a number of semi-structured interviews. Our initial focus was on particular on algorithmic imaginaries, indeed, as well as tactics. We were curious to see how people perceived algorithms and the way in which they worked around them, as well as forms of organized action. But we kept our interviews also pretty open and followed the themes that spontaneously emerged from our interviewees. And these contributed to steer our research also a bit in other directions, which are the main focus of these preliminary findings that we are now presenting. So as said, the main focus ended up being Buenos Aires, so it will have a specific part on that. However, in terms of themes that emerge across context, which seems to be somehow perceived as important issues in different contexts, we have aspects of rigidity of the interface or of the app or of the algorithm, let's say of the app in general, and insensitivity indeed to individual as well as local conditions. So the context, the local context enter into the picture directly through this idea that some writers have of the app not being tailored to the specific context in which they operate. For example, in Amsterdam, one thing that emerged a couple of times was the fact that the app does not consider a distinction between a regular bike and an electric bike when assigning a route, at least for Thaus-Besorge, I believe, which is one of the app platforms operating here. And these, of course, create issues for the riders. Uber Eats has, for example, a very aggressive notification system that interferes and disrupts strategies that workers often put into place, which is that of using two apps at the same time. So indeed, in most cases, in many cases at least, riders work for more platforms. And one of the strategies that they developed is that of using in a very, let's say, strategic way, two apps at the same time, trying to maximize the accept works also based on logic of maximization. And Uber Eats and its aggressive notification system disrupt, let's say, the strategy by, let's say, not allowing riders to compare the dynamics of two apps at the same time. A number of issues emerge with GPS and maps, of course, and yeah, this can create a lot of hassles because in order to complete a task, people have to not only deliver at the right address, but also then move to the wrong address provided at the map in order to complete the task. And in terms of, well, another aspect that will also come up later with the focus on Buenos Aires, but it's common in general to different contexts, is the fact that whereas we were indeed more interested in issues of algorithmic transparency, the issue that riders themselves find, say, more important and affecting their working condition the most is the fact that they don't have direct communication in terms of support in case something unexpected happens. And yes, so this was a bit of a surprising findings in the sense that it's really quite recurrent. and way more perceived, way more felt than other aspects associated with the remuneration of the work or how different works are assigned algorithmically. But indeed, something more interesting about this will come up with the Buenos Aires focus. Well, another cross-local aspect has to do with differences and tensions sometimes associated with the cleavage between the migrant and the local workforce. In particular, considering that the migrant workforce has a lower turnover and rely on this type of works for a living in higher percentages than the local workforce, in which sometimes adhere to the rhetoric of these platforms of a side gig to save a bit of money while studying. And nonetheless, besides this lower turnover and more centrality of the work, they seem to be less prone to demand better condition and take part in organizational efforts. And other aspects emerged as context specific. So, for example, in the case of Amsterdam, it turned out that a deep knowledge of the city is by far the key resource to, let's say, optimize and improve working conditions from the perspective of the riders. Well, Amsterdam is notoriously a very bike-friendly city. And however, there are a number of, let's say, unofficially bikeable areas, as well as a number of shortcuts that someone without, sedimented knowledge of the topology of the city might not know, and that the maps in particular do not acknowledge. And well, these influence indeed the capacity of riders to complete tasks in a shorter time. Especially considering that the necessity to continuously look at the maps is, of course, a factor that slows down their job and create also issues of safety. This is strikingly different from Buenos Aires, in which instead the urban topology has a way more intuitive structure. Another aspect emerged from Milan is the relevance of the mobility infrastructure and of the housing market. Like, of course, the issues of housing is as bad as in Amsterdam as in Milan. However, Amsterdam is indeed relatively well connected with neighboring cities, sometimes even biking distance from other small urban centers that have way more affordable housing, while in Milan, the combination of a not really bike-friendly mobility infrastructure and expensive housing market create a lot of issues for people who are forced to work in the center of the city, but have to live outside of the city, and in certain cases entered also in conflict with the train providers who did not allow to bring the bikes on the train, like concretely forbidding them to do any type of work. So this is so after this, indeed, we would move to Buenos Aires, and I would leave the floor to Giovanni, who conducted most of the empirical work in Argentina, so knows it better than me.
Thanks, Davide, for recapping the results, especially regarding Amsterdam and Milan. So yes, indeed, I will briefly speak about the preliminary findings we have regarding our fieldwork in Buenos Aires. And in Argentina, well, since Uber Eats left the Argentinian market, there are two main players covering the segment of food delivery, which are Pedidos Ya and Rappi. And being Argentina still a pretty strongly cash-based society, both the platform allow the customer to pay with cash. They do so in different ways. So Pedidos Ya requires the riders to have a constant pocket money that basically when the riders reach the restaurant, they will pay with this pocket money the order, and they will then restore the pocket money in the moment they will deliver the order to the customer, which will indeed pay with cash. But this, like the totality, I think it was 12 interviews out of 12 interviews of the riders working for Pedidos Ya, complained about the fake orders, what they call the falsos pedidos. which basically consists in the riders paying the order in the restaurant, arriving to the address, realizing the address does not exist, and the mobile phone provided it's not existent, which leave them basically with the option to try to go back to the restaurant to ask for a refund, which is mostly refused. So basically the riders find themselves losing the money. Like they could apply for a refund with the platform, but that's usually a very long process that end with nothing. Whereas like instead Rappi does not make the riders pay, but when the riders complete the delivery and gets the cash from the customer, it's temporarily banned from, I mean, it's blocked from the platform. Like they cannot receive other gigs up until they actually transfer this cash money to the platform. This is done through Pago 46, which is a payment infrastructure that can be found in several kiosks. So during the day, the riders actually queue in the kiosk for sometimes a very long time in order to make this transaction. But during the night, when kiosks are closed and when the demand is higher, so the riders are usually in a much more hurry because they have the chance to get more orders, they find themselves unable to actually complete this transaction through kiosk. So what they do, like they rely on an informal ecology of service providers, which are basically represented from person in the street. Telephone numbers of this person are shared among the riders on WhatsApp group. And so they will reach this person in the street and they will do this transaction in order to unblock and receive new gigs. So this, yeah, in both cases, like this use of cash kind of is left like, yeah, creates some quite some problem for the riders themselves, which are not paid to deal with all this like yeah, informal work regarding the use of cash. Another point we found is indeed, as Davide was mentioning previously, a big problem toward the communication with support with the platform. But whereas in Milan and Amsterdam, this is mostly connected with a question of efficiency. In this case, like in the case of Buenos Aires, it's mostly connected with an issue of security. Indeed, like if there is some problem with a customer, waiting especially in residential areas, usually not very busy at night, really creates like a lot of risk of being robbed for them. And another problem is that both Pedidos Ya and Rappi don't provide the riders with the information of the final destination of the delivery. So they will find out when they will reach the restaurant what is the actual area of the delivery. And riders showed quite some concern on specific areas. So when they would find out that it's an area they don't want to deliver to, they would try to speak with support to cancel the order or the delivery or the gig from their side, let's say. But obviously this does not happen, like in the sense that support is very slow and does not permit them to do so. So they found themselves with two choices: either completing the order at their own risk, or to cancel the gig and face 1 hour of ban from the platform. A third point we found, it was a very marked cleavage between the center and the periphery. Specifically, we refer with periphery to Conurbano, which is a strip of district that surrounds the center, like a first part of the metropolis, and where several million of people live. So in Conurbano, riders mostly use motorbikes and not bikes because of the longer distances and the dismal roads they have to navigate. Like it is actually easier to navigate this through with motorbikes. So whereas security is a concern both in center and in the periphery, in the center it's mostly related to specific areas, whereas in the periphery, where in the Conurbano, it is felt as a constant concern. Indeed, it is a common practice for riders to cover their driving plate in order to, because like one of the most risky moment, according to the interviews, it's red traffic lights in which the rider is actually stopping, and it's most exposed to robbery or security risks. So it's a common practice to cover the driving plate in order to be able to pass through the red light without incurring in fine if they feel some danger around themselves. Another always connected with the issue of security is the presence of police, which is in the city center. Mostly, it's felt as a feeling of safety, whereas in the conurbano, it's again one more security threat. It's felt as such. Indeed, several riders have reported having to pay bribes to avoid the seizure of the motorbikes under false allegations by the traffic police mostly. And in this context, it's where we found the most widespread and strike among food delivery riders in a moment in which like there was a huge wave of news about security, basically a lot of robbery and actually even an homicide of food delivery riders. The police made a mass seizure of 80 riders' motorbike in a place quite remote, close to a place where all the riders would pass through. So they felt that this was a targeted operation, and this led to a quite big strike in the southern part of Conurbano. At this point, I will actually leave again the word to Davide for the final implications.
Yeah, and indeed, actually, the last thing you mentioned, Giovanni, give me the floor to so I believe that a follow-up of this would be to focus indeed on how differences in the urban context affect also forms of mobilization, because it is quite clear that indeed there are urban level elements that have an effect on working conditions. We've seen it, for example, on proportion of unpaid labor, so not like only minor things. So without repeating things too much, another probably interesting aspect is a methodological one, because the difference, urban differences also affected the recruitment process, in the sense that conducting this type of research in Amsterdam proved way more difficult in terms of approaching the riders for mundane urban aspects, such as, for example, the fact that if the temperature is not particularly comfortable, as often happens, the riders tend to wait inside very small restaurants, making the approach way more difficult than, for example, in Buenos Aires, where the riders usually do not go to the door when they wait for a delivery, so for someone to pick up a delivery. Usually, for I believe safety reasons, the people that call the rider walk down to pick up at the front door in these huge buildings, and this might take up to 5-7 minutes, where the rider is very relaxed, has nothing to do, is just waiting, and is very approachable from a researcher. So I find it interesting how this urban component affects also it becomes an issue also from a methodological point of view, especially for comparative work. An interesting aspect is also the fact that indeed we started with the idea that to study how the context affects the working condition of riders, we needed the comparative work, but the issue of context emerged spontaneously already in the rider's own account. So it's not just an issue for academic debate around platformization and abstract concept, but it's a very perceived issue at the level of the lived experiences of riders. And yeah, this implies also that indeed this type of ethnographic comparative work on the effects of platformization on labors is very important, and we believe also in order to draw any type of regulatory framework that cannot obviously be on the global level only. So that is it. Thank you so much.